Hi everyone, welcome to this presentation on ethical considerations in 3D digitization for the 3D Summer School held at the Institute of Classical Studies. I am Alicia Walsh. I am a digital archaeologist at Recollection Heritage and the University of Amsterdam. So in this presentation, we're going to be covering the topics of data sovereignty, intellectual property rights and copyright, digitizing public domain works, restitution and repatriation, open access and intellectual property rights, and some recommendations for going forward with your research. So if you already watched our other lesson on best practices in digitization, discussing documentation, access, and sustainability, then you will already be familiar with the FAIR principles. But to remind you, this is the governing principle surrounding scientific data management. It aims to make data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. But we also have the CARE principles, which need to be abided by when working with data in cultural heritage. This was created because data have important implications for Indigenous peoples' ability to exercise their individual and collective rights to self-determination, especially when it comes to research about their own cultures and histories. Indigenous peoples are often excluded from decision-making and their knowledge marginalized. The current movement towards open data does not fully engage with Indigenous peoples' rights and interests. So existing principles within the open data movement primarily focuses on characteristics of data that will facilitate increased data sharing among entities while ignoring power structures and historical contexts. So the emphasis on greater data sharing alone creates a tension for Indigenous peoples who are also asserting greater control over the use of Indigenous data and knowledge for collective benefit. So the CARE principles are meant to be abided by in conjunction with the FAIR principles. But of course, there can be tension between protecting Indigenous rights and interests and making data open and fair. So that's why it needs to be as open as determined by Indigenous groups. So to go through what CARE means, collective benefit means that data in the context of Indigenous research should be designed in a way that enables Indigenous peoples to derive benefit from it. So it should establish foundations for further Indigenous innovation. It should also improve self-governance and citizen engagement. Authority to control. Indigenous peoples' rights and interests should be recognized. They should also be enabled to determine how Indigenous people are represented and identified within the data. So they have the right to develop protocols for data and be leaders in the stewardship of it and access to it. With responsibility, those working with Indigenous data have the responsibility to share how data supports Indigenous people's self-determination and collective benefit. This point surrounds accountability of researchers and how projects are creating positive relationships and expressing Indigenous worldviews. And finally, we have ethics, meaning Indigenous people's rights and well-being should be the primary concern at all stages of the data lifecycle. It should minimize harm and maximize benefit to Indigenous peoples. So projects should address power imbalances, and it must include representation from relevant groups. It should also take into account potential future uses of that data. So along with ethical protocols for working with data, there are also legal ones. I am not a lawyer myself, so for this discussion, I call upon the work of Dr. Andrea Wallace at the University of Exeter, who is a specialist in art and law, and also Dr. George Nicholas at the Simon Fraser University, who works with intellectual property issues in cultural heritage. So I'd like to define these terms and then discuss how they relate to 3D digitization in the GLAM sector and the ethics surrounding it. So first, copyright is a legal protection over original works of authorship. Intellectual property rights is a type of copyright, which gives you the right to benefit from your own idea. It protects the work of human intellect. And public domain is everything by default that cannot be protected as a matter of law. so by copyright. And this can be for a multitude of reasons, including if the work predates intellectual property right laws, or if the IP has expired. And the expiration time is the life of the author plus 70 years. So archaeological artifacts are considered public domain. And according to Europeana, any digitization or digital representation of public domain works must also be public domain. But as we'll see, this is not so simple in practice. It's also important to remember that copyright is territorial, meaning something that is copyrighted in the US may not be copyrighted in the UK. And this is important to understand for restitution. So this is a very simplified explanation of each of these, but I would like to now discuss why there are so many exceptions to this and ethical implications. So once a work has passed into public domain, any material resulting from an act of reproduction around it must meet the EU's threshold of originality to be protected by copyright. Otherwise, the reproduction is also public domain. However, according to Europeana, this is a policy statement. It's not a contract. So there are still arguments that the copyright threshold is met during reproduction. In the EU, originality means the author's own intellectual creation. So theoretically, if there is a degree of originality to a 3D work, it can gain copyright. However, when we are making 3D models of cultural heritage, the goal is usually to represent it with as much accuracy as we can, which would involve not adding our own creative license to it. So a 3D model getting copyright can also depend on the method that is used. Photogrammetry is theoretically more likely to get a copyright than 3D scanning because photogrammetry uses more of an author's decision making. And of course, 3D reconstructions or 3D modeling uses a lot of originality if you're creating a visual representation from a historical written source. So to show you some examples here on this slide, the Creative Commons license are not attributable to public domain works. And Sketchfab has now given an option for institutions to license their models as public domain. However, other institutions will still use a Creative Commons license, which allows sharing for non-commercial reasons if you attribute the museum. And the reasoning for this particular discrepancy could be due to the national laws governing curation practices. So if artifacts are digitized, are they suitable for access, let alone open and downloadable access? Just because something falls into the category of public domain doesn't mean that it no longer holds cultural significance or sensitivity for other groups of people. There tends to be a certain expectation that we are entitled to another person's culture or traditional knowledge. So we need to be asking ourselves, why are we digitizing this? And whose system of value are informing that answer? So this list of considerations was given by Dr. Wallace, and I think they're really important things to be keeping in mind. What is the cultural significance of the object you are digitizing? What is its provenance? If it is held in an institution away from its place of origin, have permissions been sought from the community of origin? Has there been a request made from that community for repatriation? And this is where we need to consider restitution within our digitization works. So I include here a 3D model of the Hoa Hakanaya, originally carved by the Rapa Nui people, who have called for its return from the British Museum since 2019. So to step away briefly from digitization, I want to go over what restitution means. Restitution and repatriation is the process of restoring cultural objects to its community of origin. There have been many instances of cultural repatriation over the years, both internationally and domestically. Some examples include, most recently, almost 500 objects announced to be returned to Indonesia and Sri Lanka from the Netherlands. There's also been a marble column back to Greece from the UK in 2018. a collection of pottery artifacts to Libya from the US, and 300 artifacts back to the Niska Nation from museums within Canada. So within Europe and North America, there are laws and guidelines constituting if repatriation can legally take place and how it should be handled. Globally, we have UNDRIP, which exists for the protection of Indigenous rights. It establishes a universal framework of minimum standards for rights, including survival, dignity, and well-being of Indigenous peoples. Article 12 directly addresses repatriation, stating that Indigenous peoples have the right to use and control their ceremonial objects and the right to repatriation of their human remains. Regarding cultural institutions, it says that the states shall seek to enable access and/or repatriation of ceremonial objects and human remains in their possession through fair, transparent, and effective mechanisms developed in conjunction with Indigenous peoples concerned. However, this declaration is not legally binding. It rather represents international legal norms, so you still have countries that do not abide by this. So even though artifacts are considered public domain, they are also transplanted into national law. Therefore, the origin community may have no legal right to it, which contradicts UNDRIP's right to maintain, control, protect, and develop their cultural heritage and traditional knowledge. So some countries are legally bound to repatriate certain artifacts, some are not, and some do so voluntarily. So for example, the British Museum Act of 1963 originally forbade the repatriation of collections, and it was not until 2010 when the act was amended to allow for the return of human remains. So currently, it's still illegal to repatriate objects held in national government-funded museums in England and Wales. In the Netherlands, the National Museum of World Cultures have published their own guidelines for repatriation. It was created with the objective to address the complex histories that have resulted in the collections held in Dutch institutions and museums and outlined a way towards restitution. In the United States, there is legal legislation on repatriation through NAGPRA. This provides a process for museums and federal agencies to return certain Native American cultural items and to provide protection for archaeological sites. In Canada, there is no federal legislation on repatriation like NAGPRA. However, the BC Treaty Commission process legally binds federal museums in British Columbia to enter repatriation agreements with treaty nations. And many other museums in BC repatriate on a voluntary basis. And federal legislation has in fact been suggested, but it is still in its second reading phase as of 2019. So while there's often no legal obligation towards restitution, there is a moral one. The act of restitution can be politically and logistically complex. It's not just about the physical items, but what they represent to the nation of origin. Objects may be expressions of their traditional knowledge and beliefs vital to the well-being of a community. And there are many examples of successful repatriation, as I mentioned, that have been carried out worldwide, but they're now also joined by claims for the return of the intellectual property and other kinds of information. So digital repatriation is a term that's usually thrown around as a way to retain scientific and archaeological value of an object that is being repatriated. So digitization is not a neutral process, just as museum curation is not. It may seem like a natural and beneficial thing to digitize items, especially ones that will no longer be under the stewardship of GLAM. But we need to be fully aware of the problems associated with it. This such as accessibility, intellectual property rights of the digitization, and consent. If digitizing is done without the consent of the community who is having their object repatriated, and the digital copy is retained by the museum, and issues surrounding access to this data is not addressed, then this can be seen as a form of digital colonialism. So if the digital format and the original object is being returned, or the digital format and not the original object is being returned, then this is not repatriation. But it could be a return of information if it follows the CARE principles. Instead, I suggest that we should be striving for digital reciprocity, a term that was coined by Dr. George Nicholas, in which collaborative research brings about the repatriation of an artifact, while using digital tools to produce a reciprocal exchange of information for continued cultural research. There should be a return of the object, and if the digital tools are being used, the data can be reciprocally shared between the source community and the museum. So I want to give a couple of examples of how digital reciprocity has been achieved in the past. The first is a collaborative effort between the Smithsonian Institute and the Tlingit Nation, which shows an example of successful 3D reconstruction within repatriation. So after the passage of NAGPRA, Mark Jacobs Jr., a Tlingit clan leader in Sitka, Alaska, who was responsible for the care of his clan's cultural belongings, pursued repatriation of items that had been lost over the previous century. So a killer whale clan crest hat made in 1900 and illegally sold to the Smithsonian, a Smithsonian ethnologist was one of these items. In 2015, during the repatriation process of the killer whale hat, Mark Jacobs Jr. unfortunately fell ill and was hospitalized, which incited the Smithsonian to expedite the return. Mark Jacobs Jr. passed away a few days later, but with the hat by his side. So a memorial service was held, during which the killer whale hat was danced and transferred to the new clan caretaker, and the ceremonial object was once again able to serve its intended purpose for the community. And during the request to have the killer whale clan crest returned to the Tlingit community, staff at the Smithsonian recognized that there was an opportunity for using digital technology as an aid for cultural preservation and education. So the repatriation of the hat demonstrated the importance of clan crest objects to the community as a way to strengthen their heritage. And the Institute was looking for ways to educate visitors about the importance of repatriation. However, they also recognized that an exhibit on repatriation is difficult without aid of the object itself. Therefore, through consultations with clan leaders, the museum were authorized to laser scan the original object and create a replica to use for the exhibit in order to educate the public on the Tlingit crest object and the story of its repatriation. Another project undertaken by the Smithsonian was the Delaware replication pilot, in which, similarly to the previous example, they had created a replica of a repatriated object. In 2017, the Stockbridge Munsee tribe of Wisconsin, the Delaware Nation, and the Delaware tribe of Oklahoma requested the repatriation of culturally affiliated human remains and associated funerary objects. During the request process, a repatriation representative for the Stockbridge Munsee tribe proposed a 3D replication process where the Smithsonian repatriation officer would laser scan and 3D print a replica of a 17th century pewter pipe that had been found among one of the burials. So the original pipe was unique to the Munsee material culture and illustrated the wealth and trade relations of the people at the time. And replicating the pipe allowed them to teach others about the historic Munsee culture and about the importance of repatriation. And the original pipe was eventually reburied, addressing the spiritual concerns of the three tribes. And multiple replicas were created so that each tribe could have a copy to display in their communities to educate community members about the material culture and the repatriation. So from these case studies, we can see that there are a number of benefits. However, there are still ethical and legal implications for digitizing cultural heritage. As repatriation is often contentious due to multiple parties claiming legal ownership over an object, questions about ownership of digital copies can be even more nuanced. So who owns the data and who owns the physical copy? When a museum makes a 3D model, the licensing is attributed to the creators, so the museum, unless they license it under public domain or hand over that attribution and the intellectual property with the repatriated object. So I want to discuss the difficulties with open access through the example of the Sarre and Savoy report, which was written in 2018 for the French government's call for restitution. It was named after its authors and commissioned by the French government to look into developing a restitution strategy in order to return African cultural heritage to their communities of origin. The report caused a lot of governments outside of France to also reevaluate their restitution and repatriation policies. And one of the recommendations was about digitizing cultural heritage and sharing of digital content. So I'll share these recommendations followed by the critiques outlined by Dr. Pavis and Dr. Wallace, professors of law at the University of Exeter. The recommendations include digitized objects must be made part of a radical practice of sharing, the creation of a single portal providing access to the documentation in the form of a platform that would then be open access, and the systematic digitization of documents that have yet to be digitized concerning Africa should be established. So the problems with this: applying an open access policy onto African heritage creates a double standard if it is not also being applied to all French and international digital heritage. Furthermore, when digital images are online, they tend to be attributed to they need to be attributed to the community of origin in their copyright license and not to the museum or its creator, because then they solely own that copy and the origin community have no legal right to it. The systematic digitization is problematic because, again, the copyright will end up going to the French institutions. It's also taken away the decision-making from the community of origin that a restitution program intended to give. And this suggestion of creating a single online portal was also a topic at a 2017 symposium on repatriation titled Indigenous Perspectives on Repatriation, which was held in Canada. One key finding from this meeting was that communities would like to develop their own databases, and very few supported a consolidated inventory housed within a single institution, because it simply gives too much power to that institution. So these recommendations for digitization of repatriated material runs the risk of setting a precedence for the mass digitization of material undergoing restitution. Digitization should simply not be a condition of repatriation. So while we, especially in the digital heritage community, want information to be open access, we can also agree, along with descendant communities, that not all information should be shared. Professional archaeologists have an ethical obligation to protect heritage sites and objects from unauthorized access or damage, but we also should be assisting Indigenous communities in protecting their traditional knowledge in sacred sites or objects. In the past, access given to archaeologists and ethnographers resulted in publishing restricted information or material without permission, which naturally led to distrust. So there can, of course, be value in 3D replication of Indigenous material, exemplified by the collaborations between the Tlingit community of Alaska and the Smithsonian Museum. But the key is collaboration and respecting cultural wishes, from handling to digitizing to storing of the data to sharing online. And we can see here the 3D model is available online, but at the request of the clan, it is not downloadable. So the community has the right to determine what happens to their artifacts, if they should be digitized, and if so, where is the data stored and who owns the intellectual property. For restitution to work, the IP of materials needs to be transferred to the community of origin or remain in the custodial care of GLAM only if permission has been granted by the community. So I just want to end this discussion on a few recommendations. There should be repatriation without restriction, meaning digitization should not be a requirement for restitution. If the community does not want to digitize, there should be no digitization. The second point is that it's not so much about digital heritage itself, but within the museum sector, we should be striving for greater inclusion of descendant communities into these spaces. But also when there is digitization, it should be done absolutely in collaboration with its nation of origin. And this can also provide opportunities for training sessions in 3D methods. The fourth point comes from an article by Lorna Hughes and Andrew Prescott on slow digitization, meaning you should really be thinking about why you are wanting to digitize this material and take into consideration what the benefits are on a case-by-case basis. And what is your plan regarding budget, storage, and open access? And this leads to the final recommendation. There should be access to the 3D data for the source community, as well as mutual decisions on the copyright licenses and how the 3D copy is going to be used. As Krupa and Grime in their article in 2021 note, we should encourage source communities and archivists and other practitioners to develop curation agreements for such digital data as they would for loans of physical materials, including specifying intellectual property rights, allowable and unallowable research, ownership of data, and other applicable long-term curation concerns. While also keeping in mind that creating 3D representations and other data assumes that communities have the same access to technological and financial resources in perpetuity. The cost of long-term data storage can be an issue, as we have discussed in our other presentation. But this is especially important to address when we are striving for data sovereignty. So this was a very brief introduction to just some of the ethical concerns you may be faced with when digitizing cultural material. So this will be good to keep in mind when working on your research in the future. And here is my bibliography for this presentation. So thank you very much.